The first thing Kemal Arslan noticed about the ship was that it didn't fall. Everything fell eventually. Rocks fell. Rain fell. His father had fallen 3 years ago, from a scaffold on a construction site in Ankara, and the universe had not paused to mourn him. But this thing, this object that had appeared above the Konya Plateau in the blue hour just before sunrise, this thing descended like it had chosen to. Slowly, deliberately, the way a queen might lower herself onto a throne she had already decided was hers. Kemal was 41 years old. He had been a civil engineer for 16 of those years. And before that he had been an army conscript for 2. And before that he had been a boy who lay on his back in fields exactly like this one, and stared at a sky exactly this color and thought, there is nothing up there. There is only distance. He had been wrong about that. He stood now at the edge of the plateau, at the lip of a low ridge where the yellow grass gave way to cracked clay and loose stone, and he watched the ship come down. Behind him, inside the prefab construction office, his phone was ringing. It had been ringing for 4 minutes. He did not go back to answer it. The ship was large. That was the first honest assessment he could make. Large the way a mountain is large. Not threatening at first, just present in a way that reorganizes the scale of everything around it. It was silver-white, and its shape suggested something organic. The way a nautilus shell suggests something organic. All curves and no apologies. It caught the pre-dawn light and scattered it in directions light didn't normally go. It landed 3 kilometers away, in the flat basin between 2 ridges, and when it touched the earth, the ground did not shake. There was no boom, no explosion of displaced air. It simply arrived, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing Kemal had ever heard. He stood there for a long time. Then he went inside and answered the phone. By the time the military convoy arrived, 4 hours had passed and the ship had not moved, and nothing had emerged from it, and Kemal had drunk 2 thermoses of tea and eaten a stale simit, and written 11 pages of notes in his engineering notebook, because that was what he did when he was afraid. He documented. He measured. He drew small, precise diagrams of things he didn't understand yet, because understanding began with the habit of looking. Colonel Derya Yildiz arrived in the 3rd vehicle. She was 45, compact, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who had been shot at enough times that it no longer reorganized her thinking. She stepped out of the jeep and looked at the ship for a long moment and then looked at Kemal. "You were first on scene," she said. "It was not a question. I was already here. Night shift. We're doing a bridge assessment 6 kilometers north." He offered her the notebook. "I've been tracking it since 0447. She took the notebook, flipped through it, handed it back. "What do you think it is?" "I think it's exactly what it looks like." She nodded slowly. "So do I." They stood together at the ridge line and watched the ship, and neither of them said anything for a while. And Kemal thought, this is how it actually happens. Not with generals in war rooms. Not with presidents on televisions. It happens with 2 people standing on a ridge in the middle of Anatolia at 8 in the morning, drinking terrible tea from a thermos, watching something they have no framework for, and trying to decide what the first step is. "My orders are to establish a perimeter and wait for contact protocols," Yildiz said. "How long? As long as it takes." "That's not an answer." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." Contact came on the 3rd day, not with sound, not with radio, not with any signal that the arrays of equipment the military had assembled could detect or measure. It came with light, a beam of it, narrow and precisely vertical, rising from the apex of the ship straight up into the afternoon sky, and then, for exactly 7 seconds, the beam bent. It curved, slowly and impossibly like a finger beckoning, until it pointed directly at the cluster of human vehicles and equipment at the ridgeline. Then it switched off. Kemal was sitting on an equipment case eating a bowl of lentil soup when it happened. He watched the beam curve. He set down the soup. "Did that seem like a greeting to anyone else?" said Sergeant Tunç Karadeniz, 23 years old, from Trabzon, currently the youngest person within 3 kilometers. "Or did it seem like someone just noticed we were here and wasn't particularly impressed?" "Eat your food," Yildiz said. "Both," Kemal said. "I think it was both. They came out on the 4th day. There were 9 of them, and they walked across the basin in a formation that was not military and not ceremonial, but something in between. A moving arrangement. The way a murmuration of starlings is an arrangement, each one aware of the others without looking at them. They were tall, 2.5 meters, perhaps more. Their bodies were humanoid in the loosest sense of the word, 2 limbs for walking, 2 for manipulation, a head, a face. But the proportions were wrong in ways that were hard to localize. The neck was too long. The shoulders were too wide and set too high. The hands had one extra finger, and the fingers were jointed in the wrong places. Their faces were the hardest part, not because they were ugly, because they were almost beautiful. High cheekbones, enormous dark eyes, mouths that curved upward at the corners in a way that on a human face would read as either serenity or contempt, and on these faces read as both simultaneously. Their skin was the color of dry moonlight, pale and slightly luminous, as if the light was coming from somewhere beneath the surface. They wore what looked like layered fabric in whites and silver grays, and it moved in a wind that wasn't there. And at the front of their formation walked the one who was clearly, not by size, not by decoration, but by something in the quality of her stillness, the one in charge. Kamal would later struggle to explain what made her authority so immediately legible. It wasn't posture exactly, though her posture was perfect. It was more that the other 8 arranged themselves around her in a way that constantly refreshed the negative space she occupied, keeping her at the center of a small private clearing, even as they walked, as if proximity to her required permission. Yıldız walked out to meet them with 2 aides and an interpreter. The interpreter spoke 6 Earth languages and had been flown in from Ankara and was now, Kemal noted, visibly trembling. The meeting lasted 22 minutes. No human language was spoken by the aliens. They communicated in a way the interpreter could not interpret. Tones and harmonics at the edge of audible range, layered in patterns that produced in the humans, present a series of involuntary emotional responses. First a deep calm, then a disquiet, then something close to awe. Not because the sounds were beautiful, though they were, because they felt intentional, because they felt aimed. Yıldız came back alone, her face was still. She walked past Kemal without looking at him, went into the command tent, and sat down at the folding table and put her hands flat on it and looked at her hands for a long time. Kemal followed her in. He sat across from her. He waited. She speaks through those sounds, Yıldız said finally. We couldn't understand the words, but the linguist says the structure is. She says it's the most complex language architecture she's ever encountered. Thousands of years more developed than anything we have. She paused. They left something behind. A device. It was still warm when I picked it up. She set it on the table between them. It was a flat disc, the size of a large coin, and it hummed at a frequency just below hearing. We think it's a translation device. We think we're supposed to speak into it and it will learn. How long will that take? We don't know. What do you think they want? Yıldız looked at him for the first time since she'd come back. I think they want what anyone wants when they arrive somewhere new and powerful and announce themselves to the locals. She picked up the disc. I think they want us to understand what we're dealing with before they tell us what they've decided to do. The device learned in 11 hours. At sunrise on the 5th day, one of the alien aides approached the perimeter alone and spoke to the disc, which Yıldız held because she had not put it down, and it translated. The voice that emerged from the disc was flat and slightly hollow, stripped of the harmonic layering, but the words were clear. The Akara arrive in their time of choosing. The world below is assessed and found sufficient. The Queen of the Above Dark speaks her greeting to the surface bound. Compliance is the first gift you may offer her, Yıldız said very quietly. Compliance, the aide continued, without inflection. The Queen's court will be established in the open place. You will bring your leaders. You will bring those who speak for the many. The Queen will hear their acknowledgement and set the terms of your continuation. The aide turned and walked back across the basin. Kemal had been standing at the perimeter with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand. He thought about the word continuation. He thought about it very carefully, the way he thought about load-bearing structures. Not panicked, not optimistic, just precise, understanding what was actually being said. Continuation. Not survival, not peace. Continuation, as in a process currently underway that they had the power to either allow to proceed or to interrupt. He drank the cold coffee. He thought, that is a very specific word to choose. The court, when it was established, was extraordinary. They had assembled it overnight in the basin, and the humans watching from the ridge had seen lights moving in the dark. Not construction, exactly, but an arrangement, a settling of things into place. By morning, the space around the ship had been transformed. Low structures of a material that looked like solidified smoke defined a large open area. Lights that had no visible source illuminated it in colors that had no names in Turkish or any other language. And at the center, on something that was neither a throne nor a platform but occupied the conceptual space of both, the Queen sat and received. She had been seated there at dawn. It was now noon. She had not moved. Yildiz had brought 7 people down to the basin, including Kamal, though she had not explained why. He was not military. He was not a diplomat. He was a bridge engineer from Ankara, who happened to have been in the wrong place at an interesting time. When he'd pointed this out, Yildiz had said, "You've been watching her for 5 days and you're still asking questions instead of answers. I want that in the room." The room in this case being an alien court on an Anatolian plateau under an open sky with 11 alien courtiers arranged in a semicircle behind their queen, their faces arranged in that expression of serene contempt, watching the humans approach with the patience of people who had already decided how this would end. Kamal walked beside Yildiz and looked at the courtiers and thought about their faces, the expression. He'd been trying to place it for days, and now, as he walked toward them across the basin clay, he finally did. It was the expression of someone watching a ceremony they'd attended many times before, already knowing all the words, already knowing the ending. He found that more frightening than anger would have been. The queen spoke and the disc translated, and what she said, condensed and stripped of its harmonic layers, was this: "You are young, you are violent, you are fragmented and loud, and you have damaged the place you live in. But you are alive, and life is a condition the Akara value for reasons they do not explain to the surface-bound. You will be permitted to continue under the organization of the Akara. You will contribute what is asked of you. You will cease the activities that damage your world. In exchange, you will receive order. You will receive the cessation of your wars. You will receive the calm of those who no longer need to make decisions too large for them." She paused. The silence was absolute. The basin held no wind. "This is not a question we stated as courtesy. Acknowledgement may begin." Yildiz said nothing for a moment. Then she said, in a voice so level it was almost gentle, "We don't acknowledge." The translation disc was silent for a second. Then it spoke for the queen again, and the tone beneath the stripped words had shifted, not to anger, Kamal noted, to something more like the tone a teacher uses when a student has misunderstood a simple instruction. "You misunderstand the structure of this exchange. The Akara do not request, we inform. Your acknowledgement is a formality, not a choice." "I understand the structure you're describing," Yildiz said. "I'm telling you it doesn't apply here." The courtiers moved for the first time, not dramatically, not threateningly, just a small repositioning, a leaning in. The way an audience leans forward when something unexpected happens on stage. The queen's expression did not change, but her head tilted just slightly, and Kamal saw something in the movement that he recognized from engineering assessments. The moment when a professional looks at something they'd assumed was stable and recalculates. "You are away," the disc translated, "of what the Akara are capable of. You have seen our soul, you have encountered our kind, and still you refuse the courtesy of acknowledgement." "We're not refusing courtesy," Kamal said. He hadn't meant to speak. He wasn't sure afterward whether it was courage or just the habit of saying the precise thing at the precise moment because imprecision had consequences. Everyone looked at him. Yildiz, the alien courtiers, the queen. "We're pointing out a factual error," he said. "You've described acknowledgement as a formality, but formalities have prerequisites. You don't walk into a house and sit down before the door's been answered. Whatever we are, and I'll grant you, we're loud and violent, and we've damaged things we shouldn't have. We answered the door. You haven't waited to be let in." The disc was silent for a long moment. Then it translated his words back to the queen, and Kamal watched her face, and for the first time in 5 days that expression, that already knows the ending expression, shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. She looked at him the way you look at a problem you had solved on paper, and then found stubbornly present in the material world. They were escorted back to the perimeter without incident. That night, Yildiz and Kamal sat outside the command tent on equipment cases, and above them the sky was enormous and clear, and the ship sat in the basin below, glowing faintly, the way bioluminescent creatures glow, not to illuminate, just to be visible. "That was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've watched someone do," Yildiz said. "I was describing a load-bearing problem," Kamal said. "I do that for a living. You told an alien queen she hadn't knocked. She hadn't." Yildiz was quiet for a moment. "What do you think she's going to do?" "I think she's going to think about it," Kamal said. "I think that's the first time in a long time, maybe ever, that something has told her no, and she's going to need to decide what that means. And when she decides." He looked at the ship for a long time. "We have maybe 3 days," he said. "Before she stops thinking and starts doing, I want to use those days." He picked up the engineering notebook. "Tell me everything you know about that ship. The dimensions I measured, The materials I could observe, the movement patterns, the way it landed. I want to build a model. A model of what? Of a problem, he said. And then I want to figure out how it fails. They worked through the night, and into the next day, and into the night that followed. Kemal was not a weapons engineer. He was not a physicist. He was a man who spent his professional life looking at structures that needed to hold enormous forces without failing, and his particular expertise, the thing he was quietly acknowledged to be best at in his field, was failure analysis. You built a bridge and it fell, you called Kemal Arslan. He would look at the wreckage, and he would work backward from the break to the weakness. And he would tell you exactly where the calculation had gone wrong, and why. And what the bridge had been telling you before, it fell that you hadn't been listening to. He applied this to the ship. He mapped every observation. The way it didn't displace air on landing, which told him something about how it managed mass. The way it had no visible propulsion, which told him it was operating on principles orthogonal to anything he understood, but which still had to interact with the same physical reality he lived in. The beam on day 3 that had bent at a specific angle before pointing at the camp. He calculated the geometry of that bend 18 times, cross-referencing it with satellite imagery the military provided, until he had a precise figure for the deflection. He didn't know what it meant yet. He wrote it down. He thought about what the Queen had said. Life is a condition the Akara value, not all life. Their word, the disk's translation of their word, was more specific than that. It was closer to organized life. Life that has achieved structure. They weren't here as conquerors in the old sense. They were here as administrators. They thought humanity was worth preserving the way you preserve a building worth preserving. By renovating it, stabilizing it, taking control of its maintenance. They thought they were offering something. That was their weak point. Not arrogance exactly, certainty. The absolute conviction that what they were offering was beneficial, and therefore that any resistance was simply a failure to understand the offer. You couldn't fight that with weapons. Weapons would just confirm what they believed. That humans were violent children who needed management. You had to fight it with the one thing they hadn't accounted for. On the morning of the 3rd day, Kemal asked Yıldız for something unusual. I need to go back in alone, he said, not to talk to her, to work near the ship. I want to take readings. That's not going to happen. I think she'll allow it, Kemal said. I think she's curious. I think whoever did it in that court unsettled something in her assessment of us. And she's been watching this camp for 3 days waiting to see what we do next. If I walk down there with a notebook and a measuring instrument and start working at the perimeter of her ship, not trying to enter, not aggressive, just working, I think she'll want to know why. Yıldız studied him for a long moment. What are you actually trying to do? I'm trying to show her something, Kemal said. About how we solve problems. He walked down into the basin at 9 in the morning, alone, with his notebook and a laser distance meter and a thermos of tea. The alien courtiers watched him approach from the ship's perimeter. He stopped 20 meters from the hull and crouched down and began to measure. He measured for 4 hours. He measured the distance from the hull to specific landmarks. He measured the angle of shadow thrown by the ship at specific times. He made notes in small, precise handwriting, and he drew diagrams, and he drank his tea slowly, and he did not look up very often, and when he did, it was not at the courtiers, but at the ship itself, with the focused look of a professional assessing a structure. At 1 in the afternoon, a shadow fell over him. He looked up. The Queen stood 4 meters away, alone, no courtiers. She had walked out herself, and she was looking at him with those enormous dark eyes, and the expression on her face was something new, not the ceremony. I've attended before expression, not contemplative. Something sharper engaged, she spoke. The sound was extraordinary up close, layered and resonant in a way that the disc couldn't capture, like hearing an orchestra described by someone who had only read about music. He didn't understand a word. He held up a finger, one moment, and reached into his jacket and produced the translation disc, which Yıldız had let him borrow over her better judgment. He held it up. She looked at it. She repeated what she'd said. What are you measuring? Stress patterns, Kemal said. In the landing site. Your ship redistributed weight when it landed, distributed it in a way I've never seen. I'm trying to understand the mechanism. A pause as she processed this. Then, you are not military. No, why are you here? I was already here. I was doing a bridge assessment. The longest pause yet. Then, so quietly that the disc barely caught it. You build bridges? I do. She looked at the notebook in his hands. He held it out, open to a page of measurements and diagrams. She took it. Her hands were wrong. The extra joint in the fingers made him briefly and involuntarily aware of every one of his own joints. And she held the notebook the way you hold something unfamiliar, with a care that is also a kind of attention. She looked at it for a long time. She was not reading it, he knew. She couldn't read it. She was looking at the structure of it, the diagrams, the numbers laid out in rows. The way thought had been translated into marks on a page in the service of understanding something physical. She gave it back. You are trying to understand how it works. See, she said, through the disk, not how to destroy it. I'm a structural engineer, Kamal said. My job is to understand how things work. Destruction is what happens when you don't do that job properly. She was quiet for a long time. The sun moved. The basin was very still. You told me I had not knocked tea, she said. Yes. No one has said that to us in a very long time. How long? The disk translated her response, and the number it gave was staggering enough that Kamal sat with it for a moment before he could continue. Thousands of years. Thousands of years of arriving and being acknowledged, of stating terms and receiving compliance, of organizing species that had no framework to resist them, not because those species had been afraid necessarily, because the Akara had been so certain, and certainty, as any engineer knew, was not a load-bearing material. How many of them are still there? Kemal asked. The ones you organized. How many of them are thriving? The Queen looked at him. The question landed in the space between them like a piece of evidence. Many thrive, T, she said carefully, and the ones who don't. Silence. The kind of silence that is its own answer. We build bridges, Kemal said. That's literally the thing I came here to do before you arrived. We build them across rivers, across gorges, across distances that would otherwise keep us apart. We build them and they fail sometimes, badly, catastrophically, and when they fail, we study the failure and we build the next one better. We've been doing that for as long as we've existed. We are bad at a lot of things. He paused. But we are very, very good at building things that connect to other things, at figuring out how to make a structure hold. He looked at her directly. You didn't come here to help us. You came here because you've done this so many times it's become automatic. You have a process. You arrived, you announced, you waited for compliance. But we... He gestured vaguely behind him, at the ridge, at the camp, at the humans watching from the perimeter. We didn't comply, and I don't think you know what to do with that. Not because you're incapable. Because it's been so long since anyone didn't comply that you've forgotten there's anything else to do. The Queen stood very still. You are telling me we are flawed, T, she said. I'm telling you, you've been building the same bridge over and over for thousands of years, and no one has ever told you the design has a problem, Kemal said. I'm a failure analyst. That's what I do. I look at the break and I work back to the weakness. He looked at the ship. Your weakness isn't power. You have extraordinary power. Your weakness is that you've had it so long, you've forgotten what it's like to not have it. And you've never, in all those thousands of years, across all those species, you've never met something that would look you in the eye and say, this isn't how it works here. Knock first. The air was very still a long time past. Then the Queen did something that none of the humans watching from the ridge could have predicted. And that Kemal, who was watching from 4 meters away, would spend the rest of his life trying to describe accurately. She tilted her head back, and she looked at the sky, and the expression on her face was one that he recognized from his own experience. The expression of someone who has just understood something they should have understood much earlier, and who is deciding what to do with that understanding. When she looked back at him, the ceremony I've attended before expression was gone. If we were to begin differently, T, she said slowly, where would you suggest we begin? Well, Kemal said. He reached into his jacket and produced a slightly dented metal cup from his thermos kit. He poured tea into it. He held it out to her. Usually this is how we start. She looked at the cup. She looked at him. This is a ritual of hospitality, tea, she said. It's tea, he said, but yes. She took the cup. She didn't drink from it. Her biology, as they would learn in the weeks and months that followed, was not compatible with human foodstuffs. She held it in those wrong-jointed hands, and she felt the warmth of it, and she stood in the basin under the Anatolian sky. And what she thought, translated later through better instruments than the disc, was this. The warmth is deliberate. It is meant to be shared. They make the cup warm specifically so the warmth will transfer to the hand that holds it. This is not a technology. This is a practice. This is something they have chosen. She stood there holding a cup of Turkish tea at 2 in the afternoon on a plateau in the middle of Anatolia, and above her the sky was enormous and blue and full of the kind of light that makes things look like they could last. It did not resolve simply. Nothing like this resolves simply. There were 3 more months of negotiations, of miscommunications, of moments where the whole thing almost collapsed, including one terrible week when a group of the Akara's advanced scouts, operating independently in another region, conducted what amounted to a forced survey of a population center in Kazakhstan, and the global situation nearly exploded into something that couldn't be undone. The Queen pulled them back. It was the first time in the Akara's history of planetary contact that a sovereign had countermanded a standard protocol in response to what a surface species had said. Kemal was involved peripherally in most of the negotiations that followed. Not as a diplomat, he remained stubbornly and by deliberate choice a civil engineer, but as the person who had established the pattern, who had demonstrated the posture, who had looked at an alien queen and said, "You have a structural problem, and here is where the load is failing, and here is how we might begin to fix it." He never entirely lost the awareness that it could have gone differently, that the margin had been extraordinarily thin, that if Yildiz had not had the instinct to bring him down to the basin, if he had not had the habit of measuring instead of reacting, if the queen had been a different kind of sovereign, the kind that responds to challenge with force, rather than with that recalculating tilt of the head, none of what followed would have been possible. He thought about this on winter evenings, sitting by a window in Ankara with a cup of tea that was genuinely warm, watching a sky that now contained things it hadn't contained before. Ankara observation platforms, steady and unblinking as stars, and below them a planet that was still figuring out what it was, still building, still occasionally failing and studying the failure. His daughter was 12. She had her grandfather's stubbornness and his own habit of asking questions that cut directly to the structure of things, and she had been 10 when the Akara arrived, and so for her, it was simply part of the world. She would grow up in a world where humanity had neighbors, where the sky was populated, where the long isolation of the species was over. She asked him once, because she had heard the story, there was no version of this story that had not eventually become a story, what it had been like, what he had been thinking when he walked down into the basin alone with his notebook. "I was thinking about bridges," he said. "That's all. That's not a small thing," he said. "A bridge is a decision. It's the decision to go across something instead of around it. To say, this distance can be managed, this gap can be closed, and the way to close it is to build something that holds weight from both sides at once." He paused. "I was thinking about how the best bridges aren't the ones that are strongest. They're the ones that are most honest about the forces acting on them." His daughter thought about this. She was quiet in the way of children who are actually processing rather than waiting to speak. "So you just told her the truth?" "I told her what I saw," Kemal said, "which is the same thing." Outside, the sky was doing what the Anatolian sky always did in winter, going from deep blue to purple to the particular blue-black of very cold nights. And among the stars, which were the same stars they had always been, there were now lights that moved with intention, that had weight and trajectory and purpose. Other minds, other histories, other ways of solving the problem of existing in a universe that was mostly emptiness and cold. He thought the sky looked better for it. He thought humanity looked better too. Not because they had won anything, exactly, and not because they had been proven right, but because they had done the thing they'd been doing since someone first thought to lay 2 stones across a narrow stream. They had looked at the gap, and they had built something that went across it. They had knocked. They had offered warmth. They had said, "Here is what this place is, and here is how it works, and you are welcome to sit down, but you are going to have to learn the customs." That was not a small thing either. That was in fact the whole of it.